Two of the most common groups mentioned in the New Testament are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And these two groups of Jewish people were opposed to one another and also set in opposition to Jesus in the Gospels. So let's take a look at what they believed and some characteristics of their groups. So the Pharisees were experts on the law, or the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Old Testament and includes the laws that were given to Moses and given to the people of Israel. Now the Pharisees were experts, and they also believed not only in the law itself, but in the oral law. And the oral law, they believed, was the gift given to Moses for interpreting the law. So the Pharisees not only believed in the letter of the law, they also believed in the importance of interpreting the law. And so therefore, their focus on the laws made holiness or sanctification possible outside of the temple through following the law. And this is why we have just below the picture of the Pharisee on the left 2 icons to help remember the characteristics of a Pharisee. One is an image of the Torah on the left, another image of the mouth, to remember that they believed in an oral law and in an interpretation of the laws. And later on, after Jesus died, there was some of the laws and interpretations were written down in important books that were used by Jews for centuries and millennia afterwards, which is why the rabbis of today, the leaders of the Jewish people today, are traced back to the Pharisees. After the temple was destroyed, the Pharisees lived on. In the image of the Pharisee, you can see 2 important things. One is on the hand of the man is a phylactery, and these were boxes that contained the law, contained writings of the law in little boxes, either strapped to their heads or strapped to their hands. And they also wore blue fringes on their mantle. You can see the white garb on his head and around his shoulders. The Sadducees were priests. They were a priestly class, probably traced back to the high priest Zadok. They considered the temple to be required for holiness. So they were followers of the law, and looking at the parts of the law that talked about sacrifice and the temple, that's what they focused on as their path to holiness. Now, one important thing that was clearly stated in the New Testament was their resurrection was, according to them, the resurrection was not going to happen, that there was no afterlife, that there was no resurrection of the dead, which clearly would be opposed by Christians who Jesus was risen from the dead, so Sadducees would have rejected that belief. And they were more upper class. They were associated with the ruling class of the Palestine, of Israel, of the Greeks who were ruling the area. So the 2 icons to help you remember what they were all about are the image of the temple on the left below the picture, and then an image of a gravestone, and just to remember that they don't believe in the resurrection and they don't believe in an afterlife. So these 2 groups were actually quite opposed to one another. It probably isn't as clear in the New Testament that they were really rejecting one another in their beliefs. So they were very different in what they believed. Of course, in the left, the Pharisees accepted the law as the path to holiness, and the Sadducees focused on the temple. And of course, when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, the Sadducees, their path to spirituality was more or less of dying away, and which is why the Pharisees were able to live on, and the synagogues were able to be so important in Judaism. So the differences between the 2 of them are kind of what we talked about already: the interpretation of the Torah versus the Torah alone, resurrection of the dead versus no resurrection, a belief in an afterlife for the Pharisees and no afterlife. So the differences between these 2 groups and Jesus is Jesus was often projected as opposed to Pharisees because the Pharisees accepted strict interpretation of the law, and Jesus was saying that it's not legalism, but himself. He's the fulfillment of the law. And for the Sadducees, Jesus is of course resurrected from the dead, but he also described himself as the temple. He was even killed for saying that the temple would be destroyed and rebuilt in 3 days. So these 2 groups were important groups of the New Testament, and important to understand why Jesus was rejected by the Jewish people during his ministry.